Hi, Mrs. Showalter here.
Mr. LeBar.
And we're going to talk about cells. The information that we're covering mostly comes from your textbook, pages 4 through 7, if you want to review some of it, but let's go ahead and get started. All right, so what are cells? We've talked about this a little bit in class, but all living things are made of cells. So plants, animals, fungus, living things are made of cells. Cells form the parts of an organism and carry out all of its functions. So all the eating and breathing and thinking and pumping blood through your body that your body does all involves cells. Cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things. So they are the building blocks that make up life. All right. One single cell has all the same needs that an entire organism has. So if you think about all the things that you need to survive, water and oxygen and food, cells need those things too.
So it's really a reflection. When you feel thirsty, that's because your cells need water. When you are hungry, that's because your cells need energy. And when you need rest, it's because your cells need rest. So it's always just really, your feelings are a reflection of your cells' needs. Yeah. Your cells do not have feelings.
All right. And then as living things, we expel waste, excess water, and carbon dioxide.
And cells do the exact same thing. Our cells, they get rid of, let's say, gases and things like that. And how do we get rid of those things? We burp or we flatulate, which is farting. So.
Yeah. And also sometimes my students think, well, how do we get rid of excess water? Well, one of the ways that's kind of surprising is if you think about when you blow onto a piece of glass or a mirror, you see that fog, and that's water. Mm-hmm. Cells are involved in all of your body's functions, obtaining oxygen, food, water, getting rid of waste. Your cells are all a part of those jobs. And the cells that we have work together to keep you alive and to keep organisms alive. So they have different jobs, and they are built differently to do different jobs. All right, the cell theory. So this is just an explanation of the relationship between cells and living things. How do cells interact? All living things are made up of cells. Now, people didn't always think that, though, right?
No, they actually, one of the things, one guy, what is his name here? An Austrian engineer, Hans Horbiger, he said that he believed in the ice theory, that everything in the world, stars, planets, and even people were all composed of ice.
Okay, so they didn't know about cells, which is fairly reasonable because we didn't have microscopes, and we'll learn a little bit more about the discovery of cells, but without microscopes, you kind of just have to go with what you know and guess a little bit, right? So they had some kind of interesting theories.
Another theory that they had was that all cells, or people, we were made up of little people. And those little people were made up of even smaller people. And so we just got smaller and smaller and smaller, but it was always composed of little people.
I think it was called like homunculus. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly.
The homunculus, yes.
Cells are the basic units of structure and function in all living things. And all cells are produced from other cells. And this kind of reminds me of something we talked about early in the year, spontaneous generation. Mm-hmm. So if all cells are produced from other cells, before they knew that, there were some interesting theories about how organisms were produced, right?
Yeah, they used to, if you've ever heard of the term like an alchemist, if you've ever played a weird, like a role-playing game on Xbox or something, an alchemist is somebody, and they try to mix together chemicals and things to create life. And as we know, like, that's not possible. All cells have to come from other living cells. There used to be people that believed they had a recipe where you could get living mice from grain. And what happened is that the mice just like to eat grain and they would show up. So,
I think it was grain and underwear. Dirty underwear, right?
Dirty underwear, yes.
He left that part out for the parents that are watching. Living things differ greatly from one another, but all living things are made of cells. And the cell theory is true for all living things, including bacteria, plants, animals, fungi, protists, all of those things. All right, so there were some really influential scientists that kind of helped to develop the cell theory and what we know about cells today. Robert Hooke was one of them in 1663. He is often called the father of the microscope, but there is a little bit of debate when it comes to the microscope. It's kind of a heated debate as to who really made the first microscope.
I was in Washington, D.C. this summer, and one of the things when I went to a museum...
Here, I'm going to make you bigger.
Oh, that's fine. This is a picture that I took, and this is the actual microscope that Hooke used when he was looking at cork cells. He was the first one to see cells, and he called them cells because cells in Latin means little rooms or small rooms.
So when he was looking at it, it looked like kind of a honeycomb structure, and so each little cell looked like a small room. He was the first one to see cells. And cork is just, I don't know if we said this, but it's a slice of bark, right? Or
yeah,
like
from a tree, cork
plant.
tree. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Leeuwenhoek. Anton van Leeuwenhoek.
Anton van Leeuwenhoek.
He sounds very proper. He was, in 1674, he looked at drops of lake water, scrapings from teeth, water from rain gutters, and he saw some movement in his microscope in those specimens, and so he called those little organisms animalcules.
And if you break down the word, animal means animal, obviously, and cule just means small. So what he was looking at were small animals, what he thought.
Yeah. Didn't he also compare blood? I feel like he was also the one that compared animal blood versus, anyway, cold-blooded versus warm-blooded. We'll look that up. All right, Schleiden. In 1838, he concluded that all plants are made of cells. So he did work with plants and found that all plants that he studied were made of cells and came to that conclusion. And then a year later, Theodor Schwann concluded that all animals are also made of cells.
I think, one thing I was thinking of when we were making this is why did they not know that animal cells, why did it take them a whole year to figure out that animals are also made of cells? And I think part of that is, if you think of the differences between plant and animal cells, is that plant cells have that cell wall around the outside, which is pretty thick and it's pretty visible, whereas animal cells don't. And with the tools they were using at the time, they probably weren't able to discern, that those animal cells were actually cells because they didn't see that nice boundary around the outside.
Yeah, and I think that, when we look, we will get a chance in our classes to look at animal cells versus plant cells, and we will have that same experience. Mm-hmm. It'll be much easier to find the plant cells. It'll be very clear and easy. It'll take seconds, but the animal cells are a lot more challenging.
And they're smaller.
Yeah.
A lot of times.
Virchow in 1855 proposed that new cells are formed only from existing cells. And isn't that nice that he did that? Because people were thinking some pretty strange things before we figured that out. Okay, we have multicellular organisms and unicellular organisms. And if you think about that prefix multi, we've talked about that before, but multi means many. So something can be
multiverse,
multicolored,
multicultural.
There you go. So lots of multi, it means many. So multicellular organisms. What is multi-multi?
Multi-multis. We have multi-multis.
Okay. Multicellular organisms have different cells that have different jobs. So we are multicellular, and we have a brain cell that looks and acts differently than a blood cell, and a blood cell looks and acts differently than a muscle cell, so that they can perform their different jobs. Unicellular means single-celled or one cell, and there are lots of words too.
Mm-hmm. Unicycle.
Unibrow.
I went to college, and we had a covered dome, and it was called the Unidome.
Nice. Unicycle. Did we say that one first?
Mm-hmm.
Unicorn.
Oh.
So it has one corn. The unibrow, though, I had a biology. My biology partner when I was in high school had a unibrow. It was pretty thick. But I've seen pictures of him as an adult, and he's done some...
He's shaving.
He's doing some work there. All right. There is an organization of life. Smaller parts, like cells, come together and work with other parts to perform larger, more complex tasks. So they're always working together to do functions.
Yeah, we start with a cell, all right? And a bunch of similar cells then get together, and they'll form a tissue. And the tissue is it's a bunch of cells that get together and they do a similar job. It might be muscle tissue or something like that. Then several tissues will get together and they will perform a job, and that would be then like an organ, like your heart. Okay, it has several different kinds of tissue in your heart making up your organ. Several organs then will get together, okay, And they will then make an organ system. So then your heart would get together with your veins and your capillaries and all that, and then you have an organ system. Well, if you put a bunch of organ systems together, you end up then with a full organism.
And we have like 11 major systems in the body. We've got the nervous system and the digestive system and respiratory system, and you've learned a little bit about that in elementary school probably. All right, these are some new terms. I challenged some of my classes with these words the other day, but this is eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So this is pronounced you. And the way I remember eukaryotic cells is it sounds like you are made of eukaryotic cells. And they have a membrane-bound nucleus and a complicated internal structure. So they've got all the different organelles that we've talked about. When we did our cell cookie models, we were looking at eukaryotic cells because they have all these organelles.
And if you're wondering what a membrane is really just a flexible sheet that's able to separate two areas from each other. So a membrane would be like a water balloon. The outside of it is a membrane, or a bag is considered a membrane. It separates the things inside the bag from the things outside the bag.
Yeah, our cell membranes are made up of lipids, which is kind of like fats and oils, and so that's why fats and oils are really important, healthy ones. And so we have these phospholipid bilayers, and it's like made up of these lipids that are interlocking. And if something needs to get in the cell, they kind of separate and let that thing in. Or if something needs to get out of the cell membrane will kind of separate and let that item out, and then come back together. Now,
then we have prokaryotic cells. And prokaryotic cells, they don't have any nucleus at all. They're a lot simpler inside. They don't have as many things inside. Pretty much the only thing that we look at is bacteria, is prokaryotic. There's no animals or anything like that that are prokaryotic, just things like bacteria. They're very simple.
And they still have DNA and cytoplasm and some of those organelles, but just not as complicated as the ones we've studied.
And then we have kind of just a little chart here at the end. And, if you look on the left-hand side, you're looking at things that only plant cells have. The animal cells do not have those. The chart in the middle, or the column in the middle, both cells share those things. And then on the right-hand side, you're looking at the things that animal cells have only.
That are unique to animal cells, yeah.
And one thing I found interesting is, we know what lysosomes do, but I look at plant cells and I notice they don't have lysosomes. And so you're like, well, how do they keep things clean?
Yeah.
All right, and keep like big invaders out. And what it is since the cell or plant cells have a cell wall, that actually keeps the big things out. So that cell wall does provide some protection.
Yeah.
So there really isn't a need for a lysosome.
For larger items that could be invading the cell. So they have a different way to handle those larger invaders. Both cells, just want to note a couple of things. Both cells are eukaryotic, so they are both those complex cells, make up living things. Our students always like to say they're both cells, right?
Yeah.
And they're microscopic, so you have to use a microscope to see them mostly. Now, that's not true of, there are some larger cells. Do you know the biggest cell in the world?
Nerve cells?
Eggs.
Oh, that's right,
Egg. Yeah, nerves are for us. Yeah, they're long.
An egg, one single egg is actually one cell.
So an egg would be one type of cell that's not microscopic. All right, so I think that's it. We'll talk more about this in class, but you should be finishing up your guided notes. That's your homework, so bring your guided notes to class tomorrow and you'll be ready to go.
All right, sounds good.